Hello and welcome to Conversations in Sustainability. I'm your host for this episode, Kathy Osmond. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Guilfoyle, a communications expert with more than 20 years' experience delivering stakeholder engagement, strategic, operational and creative communications and public relations across a wide range of industries, from the meat industry to offshore wind energy. Sarah recently served for 2 years as Director of Stakeholder Relations and Communications for OceanX Energy, an Australian company working on the development of offshore wind farms here and in New Zealand. Now, for many Australians, moving towards renewable energy is an obvious step towards reducing our carbon emissions. However, it remains a deeply controversial issue. Offshore wind projects in particular have faced strong headwinds. As someone at the forefront of this, we're excited to hear from a communicator who I suspect, Sarah, has developed a thicker skin than she had a few years ago. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Kath. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sarah, you finished up with OceanX recently. Tell us about that experience with that company.
Oh, I think anyone in the OceanX team will say it's been the best job, the best team, the best platform, the best opportunity ever. And we get that a lot from outsiders as well. OceanX Energy was founded by Andy Evans and Peter Scardellis, who are considered two of the three founders of offshore wind or founding fathers of offshore wind in Australia, having been two of the people that started Star of the South, which is the most advanced offshore wind farm in Australia currently in Gippsland. When they sold out to Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, they turned their attention to other jurisdictions, in particular looking at an floating offshore wind profile in New South Wales, hence OceanX was born, and then 9 absolute stellar people were onboarded to tackle probably one of the most complex undertakings ever, looking at one of the most nationally significant infrastructure projects to happen on the eastern seaboard of Australia in modern day history. And I can't imagine anyone else that I would ever try and take that on with.
So they really were attempting to develop a whole new industry in this country. What's required of a communicator working at the pointy end of something quite unknown or unprecedented?
You've already said it about the thick skin, Kath, and it's a bit of a running joke that I get a lot of spicy emails. Fortunately, a lot of them addressed to the chair of the board, Andy Evans, which is great. But I think you need faith, courage, resilience, commitment and integrity. It's very difficult to start a whole new industry as well as try and develop up a pipeline of projects. And the complex stakeholder environment is unlike what I've ever seen before. But I think the number one thing is you have to absolutely 100% be yourself and be authentic, because people will sniff you out pretty quickly if you're not.
Speaking of stakeholders, you did describe that role with OceanX as one of the most complex internal and external stakeholder environments you've ever encountered. And, you've done a few different jobs in potentially challenging industries. So what's that complexity there?
The complexity is, I think I've referenced this a little bit earlier, in that sometimes we had to wear a project hat. So we're trying to develop up a project portfolio. So that makes us, that puts us into a very competitive market against other proponents that are also vying for feasibility licenses. And might I just clarify here that the proof is in the pudding or in the title. It's a feasibility license. It is a license that's awarded to explore the feasibility of building an offshore wind farm. It's not a license to construct. But when you look at that, it's very competitive to try and get those licenses. It's also very competitive at the end of the process to try and sell you power. But in the middle, we also need to all work together as an industry, because we are new, so we really need to be united on that front. The stakeholder complexity is insane on so many levels because of gaps in policy, gaps in quite a few spots, because these projects have never been done before on the east coast of Australia. So there are a lot of stakeholders to work with, everyone from game and commercial fishers right through to obviously the Minister's Office, federal and state ministers of many varieties, and getting people to align is very, very difficult. And I will say what is underpinning that complexity is the fact that it's brand new and it's not a proven or known quantity. So you have that added extreme interest by a lot of stakeholders, both positive and negative. And a lot of stakeholders want and need answers and clarity, but you don't always have that, which is where some of the faith and the resilience sort of comes back in talking to that. So, that's how I'd sort of address that without going into too much detail, but it's complex.
So, Sarah, I want to ask you about community as, you know, both an audience and a stakeholder. Obviously a big part of your job. You lived in Newcastle, which was the base for one of OceanX's projects, and you lived there for 6 years. What did working and living in that city amongst that community at the coalface of the energy transition teach you about social licence?
Taught me a lot, Kath. It's the short answer. But I will say I still proudly live there. Newcastle has a very interesting history, and they've got a history of lots of great opportunities and growth, significant periods of growth, but they've also been burned a lot in a few projects that have run through the area, and communities are getting smarter and more empowered, and quite rightly, they are now well legislated to have a vested interest and be required to be included in consultation. It is very interesting. We do have a lot of community members that are not in support of the offshore wind farm. We also have many who very much are, and then some people in the middle who are seeking more information that we're looking to work with. But Newcastle has been through a lot of change. I think potentially in the community and more broadly in Australia, without being too controversial, I think we maybe got off on the wrong foot a little bit with the industry. I think we should have gone out with an education campaign before we even looked at an information campaign or any sort of consultation. I think we've got a little bit of work to do there now to sort of backtrack off that. And like I've even said to Minister Bowen personally, I said, you can't be upset at a stakeholder for not knowing information or the correct information if they haven't been afforded the opportunity to be given that. And that remits on us, and that's our job to work through that over the next 5 to 7 years and looking to get all of those projects up and running.
When you say on us, you're talking about people in OceanX, or are you talking about?
I'm actually talking about the industry.
Okay.
And I come from the school of thought where I don't believe that stakeholder engagement and comms operates as a unique stream or a stream in isolation. It's very much a strategic function that needs to sit at the very beginning of any project, and it underpins all of the other work streams. So I'm a firm believer that good stakeholder engagement and communications is every single person's responsibility in the industry. I would also go so far, and potentially a bit controversially, to say that I think we definitely need more alignment as an industry, because while we're in that competitive proponent phase, it puts us sometimes at loggerheads with each other and we're not aligned. And I think that can be very confusing for the community. I think we need to do a much better job holistically as an industry to better educate around the reality of what the offshore wind industry can present in terms of challenges, but also what it can present in terms of opportunities.
And, if there's a vacuum in information, then misinformation, disinformation will flourish. Does it feel to you that the last couple of years in particular have been marked by a lot of disinformation?
There's definitely been some backfilling of misinformation. All I can encourage anyone who has any concerns, if you're for, against, or sitting on the fence, is just remain open to conversations and just keep an open mind to understand the bigger picture about the energy transition and understand where our power and our energy comes from, but also the job opportunities as well. So yes, there has been a lot of misinformation there, but also we have honoured essentially a remit to basically not fully engage with stakeholders until at which point we have been awarded a formal licence, because otherwise it gets very confusing for community members because they don't know who's actually going to be awarded the licence. So, for example, in the Hunter, originally, like 18 months ago, we were looking at potentially 20 proponents for potentially maybe 3 to 4 wind farms. It ended up being 8 applications with 1 licence being awarded. So you can imagine the impact of various proponents coming in, promising the world or saying they're going to do this and that, or you've got them all knocking on the doors of the local Aboriginal lands councils and the city councils and the supply chain, and not everyone in the region is resourced for that. So we've been very mindful, even though we got in very early, 3 to 4 years ahead in Newcastle, and also Ocean X Energy were very smart in their investment and visible dedication to Newcastle and the Hunter by putting their Director of Stakeholder Relations and Communications, myself, who was already living there at the time. It was very, very smart. But when the official process started and a lot more proponents came into the mix, we made the concerted effort and followed federal government's advice to wait until we had the paper in our hand. So the minute we get awarded that formal licence, we will spend the next 5 to 7 years doing as much as we can to help people understand how we can coexist, what the challenges are that we're going to have to face, including mitigation and management measures, and of course the opportunity for jobs, for people to stay in the region, high-paying jobs, local jobs, and an absolute golden opportunity for areas like the Hunter to become the economic regional super powerhouses that they deserve to be.
So wind energy has had a fairly difficult birth as an industry in Australia. What do you think have been the main issues there? What's driving people against wind in particular?
So I think it's a number of things. First of all, change is hard. Change is very, very hard. But also, what also is very difficult is coming home at night and not being able to turn your lights on in your house and cook dinner for your family and charge your mobile phone, of course, in this day and age. So the continuity of power supply is at the forefront of that. I think also in Australia in particular, notwithstanding what I just said about change, it's really been the west coast of Australia that has seen that offshore infrastructure with their well-established oil and gas interests over there. We haven't got anything like that on the east coast of Australia, and I think that sort of compounds that change factor. I think when people go overseas to Europe and have a look in other areas of the world where offshore wind is well established, it can be a game changer for people to understand. I think once the first offshore wind farm goes in, which will likely be Star of the South, and we start putting power into the grid, I think that will be a serious pivoting point for the industry.
And will you be there in the offshore wind industry when that happens?
Well, my heart will always lie in offshore wind because I've been advocating for it for a number of years now. I feel very strongly. I understand the economic opportunities for the regional areas that come from it. I also fear about us not completing the energy transition in a safe and fast enough way, and I worry about the lights going up and people not having jobs. So I will always advocate for offshore wind. As for where I pop up next, well, Kath, you'll just have to watch this space. Can't give too much away.
Okay, all right. Well, I think yes, we'll have to keep looking at your LinkedIn page, right?
Well, absolutely. I do like my LinkedIn game. I think it's quite strong. But might I also say, hey, this is my first podcast, so this could be the birth of my career right here. But I certainly give you and Green Horizon full credit for that.
Okay. You mentioned Minister Bowen, and of course government is one of the key stakeholders that you've been working with. Especially tricky when your topic is a political football, as it is at the moment. What are your top tips for communicating with bureaucrats and politicians?
Well, I guess it's the same with all stakeholders. You've got to try and understand them as best you can. Personally, I'm very disappointed that the energy transition has been politicised, because the vision of the energy transition and what we need to do to replace baseload gigawatt scale that's going to come out of the grid from the shutting down of coal-fired power stations is significant, and it's our responsibility to run all of those sort of opportunities to ground, and it's very difficult to have such a long runway into an industry when you have to work in political cycles. So that is very difficult. to manage that. That's one thing. But look, at the end of the day, I started a not-for-profit when I went to university in Florida, and we recruited Alicia Keys onto our board of directors. And she just used to say to me all the time, Gilly, I just love talking to you because you just talk to me like I'm a normal human. And I said, well, just because you've won Grammys, mate, yes, you are still a normal human. And I think we need to remember that we need to be kinder to each other wherever we sit in the political cycle. And I think we need to work more closely together. I think we all need something from each other. So I think the main thing is just to try and keep those lines of communications open, be kind to people, and but we are a bit of a political football at the moment, which is compounding some serious issues, but we'll see what happens next.
Well, I'm sure despite the challenges, we'll see you, dipping your toe into the blue economy communications waters pretty soon. Have you got a hero in this space that you would like to nominate?
Oh, yeah, that's a bit of a tough one. I've actually got two, probably. One is a bit of an unsung hero. The other one's much more, I guess, sort of out and proud. So one of my best friends from boarding school has inadvertently, even though she's from outback Central Queensland as well, she was not unfortunately she was not fortunate enough to be born in Claremont, the jewel in the crown of Australia. Insert hand gesture here, everybody. As I was, she's from Billawheeler, but through her stellar career of economic development, particularly in the South Pacific, she has become one of the world's foremost experts on Pacific tuna. So since working in offshore wind, obviously one of our biggest stakeholders is fishers and other marine users and users. So we really need to make sure we get that coexistence piece right, and we work very closely with them. So whilst tuna is not really the big market in any of the jurisdictions where we were looking at projects, having her as a bit of a mentor to me, understanding everything from game to professional fishing and how things work, has been absolutely instrumental in helping me understand better, which I think her being one of my heroes has helped me engage better with those different stakeholders. I think the other one that I'd probably mention, and it's a little bit blue economy, but it's definitely more broader for renewables, is Tim Buckley. I'm sure you've seen a lot of his commentary online. Whether or not you agree or disagree with what he says, I always find it very, very impressive when people are genuine, when they're not afraid to speak their mind, when they're brave and they're courageous in their commentary. And I think that is Tim, and I think he does a great job in helping educate around the energy transition.
Well, I think that's you as well, speaking your mind, Sarah. But, when you're in a social situation in Newcastle and somebody says to you, oh, those offshore wind turbines, they kill whales, et cetera, how do you handle that?
I think I just say, do they though? So I'm not a whale expert. We need to spend 5 to 7 years studying whale migration, other mammal migration. We need to do the bird and wildlife studies as well. We don't have any data. That data set does not exist for the east coast of Australia. So we don't have that evidence yet, but the onus is on us to get that evidence and to prove that case up. Otherwise, we won't be able to build a wind farm. If we can't understand it, measure it and mitigate it or manage it, then we'll be dead in the water, sort of pardon the pun. But I would also say that Greenpeace has actually come out and have said there is no evidence to say that offshore wind farms impact whales. But with that said, I always say the best stakeholder is an engaged stakeholder. The worst stakeholder is an ambivalent stakeholder. So even if you're yelling at me or you don't agree with me, at least you're still engaging, and that's an opportunity to have a conversation. There's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so I just listen. And then I ask them if they would like to know more, give them my card, always open, think of any follow-up questions, let me know what you need. But yeah, we are at the front of the coalface. We get a lot of hairy questions. A lot of people are very upset about it, but that's just another opportunity to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Sarah, I want to thank you very much for coming in. We're very excited to see what you do next. and it's been delightful to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate your time as well.
Thanks.